What exactly am I supposed to do with this? Ronan Keyes lifted the cedar box above the table with 2 fingers, the way someone might hold a piece of rubbish they hadn't wanted to touch in the first place. His voice had found the microphone. One of the servers had offered it to him during the gift portion of the evening, a tradition at his annual industry dinner. And now that voice filled every corner of the private dining room at the Ravine Club, with a precision that left nowhere for the silence to hide. Around him, 40 of the most well-connected names in Toronto's development and finance world sat watching. Some leaned forward, some exchanged glances across table centerpieces. Some already had their phones angled, not quite filming, but not quite not filming either. Tola Dankwa stood near the far wall, still and quiet in a dress the color of deep burgundy, her hands at her sides, watching the man she had spent the past 18 months believing she understood. He was turning the box over under the low light, examining it with his head tilted as though he genuinely could not determine what he was looking at. "I mean," Ronan said, his smile settling into something that was less amusement and more performance. "It looks like something from a church basement sale." The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was enough. Maeve Halston, seated 2 chairs down from Ronan, raised her champagne flute just slightly, not quite a toast, just a small self-satisfied lift of the wrist that Tola noticed and understood entirely. Ronan set the cedar box back down on the white tablecloth, not gently, and looked across the room until he found Tola's face. When he did, he shook his head in a slow, theatrical way that said more than any sentence could have managed. 40 people flew in for this dinner," he said into the microphone. "And you brought me something you made in a garage." Tola did not flinch. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, the way she had learned long ago to hold a room's attention without raising her voice. Then she walked to the table, picked up the cedar box with both hands, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the door. She did not run, she did not cry, she did not look back. To understand what Ronan Keyes had just destroyed, it helps to know where the cedar box began. Tola Dankwa grew up in Scarborough, in a narrow house on a street where 3 families sometimes shared a driveway because parking was cheaper that way. Her father, Joseph, was a carpenter who had come from Ghana with $1,200 and a second-hand set of chisels, and he spent 30 years building furniture for people whose houses he would never be invited to sit inside. He died when Tola was 19, leaving behind a workshop that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, a mortgage that was 3 months behind, and a daughter who had already decided, sitting at his workbench the summer she was 16, that she would build something he would have been proud of. She did not build it with wood. She built it with code. Ridgeway Technologies began in the spare bedroom of an apartment she shared with 2 other women in North York on a used laptop that overheated if she ran more than 4 programs at once. She took contracts no one else wanted, worked nights and most weekends, and reinvested every dollar she made before she spent anything on herself. By the time she was 28, Ridgeway had 12 employees and a client list she was legally obligated to keep confidential. By 35, she had declined 2 acquisition offers from companies whose valuations she would quietly surpass within 4 years. She kept almost none of this visible. It was not arrogance that made her careful. It was something her father had said once, in the workshop, while he was fitting a dovetail joint with the patience of a man who understood that the important things could not be rushed. He had told her that the people who learned what you were worth before they bothered to learn who you were would never truly understand either one. She had been 16 when she heard it, and she had been carrying it ever since like a level in her coat pocket. Something she pressed to the surface of every new relationship before committing to it. She lived in a modest condo in the annex. She drove a 7-year-old Subaru. She told people she worked in tech consulting, which was accurate enough not to be a lie and vague enough not to invite the wrong kind of attention. When she introduced herself at parties, she gave her first name and nothing else. And she paid close attention to whether the conversation that followed was led by genuine curiosity or by a search for a number to attach to her face. Ronan Keyes had seemed in the beginning to be neither. They had met at a friend's housewarming in Leslieville, and he had spent the first 20 minutes asking her about a book she had been holding when she walked in. Not what she did for work, not where she lived, just the book. She had thought, here is someone who sees what is actually in front of him. She had been wrong about that, but it had taken her 18 months to understand it fully, and even then she had needed him to make the lesson impossible to miss. The cedar box she brought to the Ravine Club that evening had taken her 4 months. She had started it in January, in the corner of her storage unit, where she kept her father's chisels, working on weekend mornings before the building's other residents were awake. She had chosen the cedar because it was her father's preferred wood for anything meant to last. He used to say that cedar held its character even after decades, that you could sand it back and still find the same grain underneath. She fitted the joints by hand, the way he had taught her, cut the interior to hold small keepsakes, and carved Ronan's initials into the lid in the same blocky serif font her father had used for his own maker's mark. Inside the box, she had placed a folded letter. She had not told him it was there. She had imagined him finding it later, privately, sitting somewhere quiet, and understanding what she had been trying to say. She had been planning, in the weeks following the dinner, to sit down with Ronan and finally tell him the rest of the truth. Not just the story of the box, but the full shape of the life she had been living beside him, without fully revealing. She had rehearsed it during her morning commute, imagined his face moving through surprise towards something she hoped would look like tenderness. She had wanted to know, first, that what they had built together was solid enough to carry the additional weight. The dinner, she had thought, would tell her what she needed to know. It told her. The Ravine Club's annual industry dinner operated as a kind of social audit. Attendance confirmed standing, the seating chart signaled alliance, and the gift presentation had become, over the years, a ritual performance of whose taste and resources were worth the room's attention. Ronan had invited Tola for the first time this year, which she understood as a statement of some kind, though she had not yet decided what kind. Maeve Halston had been at the last 3 of these dinners. She came from the sort of Toronto family whose philanthropy had buildings named after it at Yonge and Bloor, and she had never fully reconciled herself to Ronan's choice to be with someone who, by all external appearances, had arrived at this table from considerably further outside it. She did not say so directly. Maeve was too practiced for directness, but she had spent the cocktail hour making small, surgical observations about Tola's dress, her shoes, the fact that she had taken the subway rather than a car service, and by the time everyone was seated, the room had absorbed a vague impression of Tola as someone who did not quite belong at this particular table. Ronan had laughed along more than he should have. He told himself it was harmless banter between old friends. He was wrong about that, and some part of him knew it, and he laughed anyway. The gift portion came after the main course. Other guests had brought the expected things. A case of Japanese whiskey, a weekend booking at a private lodge in Muskoka, a set of monogrammed leather accessories in a box that announced its own price through its weight alone. When Ronan reached Tola's package, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine, the room's attention sharpened in the way it does when it senses a contrast it can enjoy. He unwrapped it slowly, which was its own kind of cruelty, stretching the anticipation for everyone watching. When the cedar box emerged, he turned it over once, twice, studying it with exaggerated confusion, while Maeve's barely suppressed smile spread through the nearest cluster of guests, like something that had been waiting for its cue all evening. Then he picked up the microphone. What came next lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but it settled into memory the way longer things do. He held the box up so everyone could see it. He questioned aloud whether Tola had misunderstood the venue. He compared it to something you'd find at a craft market on the Danforth, and the laughter from a section of the room, not everyone's, but enough, confirmed that the cruelty had found its audience. He said, in a voice still using its party register, that he had always suspected the gap between them was more than just a matter of aesthetics. Hadis said it the way a man says something he has been thinking for a long time, and has simply found the occasion to finally release. He set the box back on the tablecloth when he was finished, not gently. Tola picked it up before it stopped moving. She did not say a word. She looked at him once, not with anger, but with the clear, unhurried expression of someone who has just received the answer to a question they had been asking quietly for months. And then she walked the full length of the dining room toward the exit. Past 40 people who had gone very quiet, past Maeve's carefully arranged face, past 2 servers who stepped aside without being asked. At the threshold she paused for just a moment, not from hesitation, but because she was settling the cedar box more securely under her arm. Then she pushed through the door and was gone. She was crossing the club's main lobby when she heard her name. Mrs. Dankwa. The woman near the reception desk was holding a notepad, a press badge clipped to her blazer. Farida Nouri, a technology reporter for the Financial Post, who had been covering Ridgeway's upcoming public offering for the past 6 months, and happened to be at the club that evening for an unrelated interview in an adjacent dining room. "I thought that was you," Farida said, and then, registering something in Tola's expression, added more carefully, "Are you all right?" Tola nodded once and kept moving. She did not know that Farida had turned to one of the club staff to ask whose private dinner was taking place next door. She did not know that the lobby's magazine rack, which she passed on her way to the coat check, held 30 copies of that month's issue of Canadian Business, with her photograph on the cover, Ridgeway Technologies, the company that changed quietly, or that 3 of Ronan's guests would see those copies on their way out before the evening ended. She did not wait to see any of it. She collected her coat, walked out into the cold October air, and stood on the pavement for a moment with the cedar box under her arm, breathing. Then she called a cab and went home. By morning, the pieces had arranged themselves into a shape that was very hard to misread. The consequences arrived quickly and without sentiment. 2 of Ronan's investors, men who had shaken his hand at that dinner, who had been in the room while he held a cedar box in the air and called it a joke, placed calls to his firm's managing director the following week, citing concerns about judgment. One canceled a pre-construction commitment that Ronan had built his spring projections around. The managing director suggested, in the measured language of institutional self-protection, that Ronan consider a reduced public-facing role while the situation settled. It did not settle. The video, assembled from 2 phone recordings by a dinner guest who had neither liked nor disliked Ronan particularly, but had a clear-eyed sense of what the footage was worth, circulated first within Toronto's tight professional circles, then wider. It was not viral in any dramatic sense. It was something more corrosive. It was simply seen by everyone who needed to see it, and they shared it with exactly the people who mattered most to Ronan's professional standing. Maeve Halston issued a carefully worded statement through her family's communications firm. She described herself as a long-standing acquaintance of Mr. Keyes, with no direct involvement in the events of the evening, which was technically accurate and entirely dishonest at the same time. She did not return his calls after that. She did not return anyone's calls who might connect her name to the footage. She was, in this as in most things, very efficient. Ronan found himself spending that winter in a quiet he had not chosen, in offices that felt different now that the invitations had stopped, in meetings where the warmth had been replaced by something more professionally courteous and considerably less genuine. He returned often, in idle moments, to the image of a cedar box, lifted off a white tablecloth by steady hands, tucked under an arm, carried out of a room by a woman who had not needed a single person in it to tell her she was worth protecting. A letter arrived at his office 6 weeks after the dinner, hand-delivered, no return address. His name in handwriting he recognized immediately. She wrote that what had broken that evening was not her confidence in herself. That had remained intact, she said, exactly as it had been before she walked into the room. What had broken was her willingness to wait for evidence that never came. She had been waiting, she explained, for one clear sign that the man beside her would choose her without needing the room's permission to do so. She had brought him something built from wood. Her father would have recognized, fitted by her own hands on Sunday mornings in a storage unit that smelled of cedar shavings, filled with a letter no one else had read, because she wanted him to understand that this was the kind of love she knew how to give, specific, unhurried, and made entirely for him. She did not write that she was worth more than he had understood. She did not need to. She wrote only that she hoped he would eventually find something, in his life, worth building slowly, without an audience, because that, she said, was the only kind of thing that lasts long enough to matter. Ronan read the letter standing at his office window, looking down at King Street, the city moving below him with its usual indifference. By the time he finished it, he had sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, and the page still in his hands, which was not something he had done since he was very young. He reached out through a mutual acquaintance 4 months later, asking whether Tola would be willing to meet. He had not expected her to agree. She agreed. They met on a Saturday morning in late autumn, on one of the gravel paths that wound through Riverdale Park, the downtown skyline visible through bare trees to the west. The air carrying that particular Toronto cold that arrives before anyone has quite accepted that summer is over. Ronan had come early. He was wearing the coat he wore when he was not trying to make an impression, which Tola noticed immediately, and which told her something about how seriously he was taking the morning. He did not come with excuses. He told her, in the direct manner of someone who has run out of the energy required for performance, that he had spent months reviewing what he had done in that dining room, and that he now understood his cruelty had never truly been about her, or the box she had brought him. It had been about a room full of people he had spent years working to convince of something about himself, and about that particular terror of being laughed at instead of laughed with, and about the broken thing in him that had chosen, in a single unguarded moment, to offer her to that room in order to stay on the right side of it. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way people say things when they have stopped, hoping the saying will undo what was done. Tola listened without interrupting. The path was quiet, a few dog walkers passing at a distance, the leaves from last week's rain still dark against the gravel beneath their feet. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him one question. "If I had walked into that club," she said, her voice even and without accusation, "with no public offering behind me, no cover story, no company at all, just the woman you had been having dinner with for 18 months, would you be standing here right now?" Ronan opened his mouth. The honest answer did not come. Not because he did not know it, because he did, and it was not the kind of answer a person could say aloud to the face of the person it concerned. Tola waited, not unkindly, for the silence to complete itself. Then she said that she had cared about him genuinely, and that she believed parts of what they had shared were real, and that she wished him a life built on something steadier than the approval of rooms. She said it without bitterness, in the tone of someone who had finished grieving the loss some time before this conversation and was now simply closing a door she had already moved past. Then she put her hands in her coat pockets and walked back along the path she had come from. He did not call after her. Some things, once said clearly, do not require a response. A full year passed after that morning in Riverdale Park. Tola spent most of it working, which was not new, but working differently, with a deliberateness that those around her noticed and quietly remarked upon. Under her direction, Ridgeway Technologies expanded into 3 new markets, acquired a small, education software firm she had been watching for 2 years, and launched a fellowship program for young Black women in STEM from communities like the one she had grown up in across Scarborough. She reviewed every fellowship application herself, reading each essay at her kitchen table on Sunday evenings with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, because she remembered exactly what it had cost her to be someone nobody saw clearly until she had already built something they could not ignore. She still drove the Subaru. She still lived in the annex. She still introduced herself at gatherings by her first name and nothing else, and she still paid attention in the first few minutes of any new conversation to what people did with that information before they knew anything else about her. The cedar box sat on the shelf above her father's chisels, in the corner of the storage unit where she had built it. She had repaired the small scuff along the bottom edge where it had come down against the tablecloth. The letter she had written was still inside, folded the same way she had folded it in January, untouched. One morning, not looking for a reason, she opened the box and read the letter herself, standing in the storage unit in her coat, the smell of cedar and old wood close around her. When she finished reading it, she folded it carefully back along its original creases and set it inside again. Some things are built for the making, not the giving. Her father had understood that. He had spent 30 years making beautiful things for people who never thought to ask who had built them, and he had kept building anyway, steadily, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew that the work and the worth of it were not the same question. She closed the box, set it back on its shelf, and turned off the light. What remained in the end was not a story about money revealing itself at the necessary moment. It was something quieter than that, and considerably harder to manufacture, and far more difficult to take from a person once they have decided to carry it with them. It was the knowledge of what you are worth before anyone in the room has had the occasion to decide. It was the particular steadiness that belongs to people who build things slowly, with their own hands, in rooms where no one is watching. And it was, perhaps most of all, a kind of grace, unhurried and unshakable, that no ballroom, no investor, and no man with a microphone had ever truly been in a position to give or take away.